Hello, and welcome to Hedgehog Storytime, where I read my weird original fiction. The following story is part of the Mayhem Cerebrum project, linked to the playlist in the description below. Yes, you have to read them all. No, that is not a request. Part 1 was so nice and calm with a little bit of intrigue. Yeah. Y'all know me better than that. Without further ado, here is On Midnight Wings, Part 2. As he lay in the dark of his room, Kuro's back ached. Of course it did. Bushin had whipped him for over 30 minutes. It wasn't as if the whip had been barbed or anything, but it had certainly broken skin, and now the lines that were cut into it throbbed in time with his heartbeat. Despite the pain, the one thing he kept coming back to was Akka's face as they sat side by side on their knees. Clearly, whatever punishment he'd been expecting, it hadn't been this. Horror, shock, revulsion, he flicked rapidly through these emotions, his eyes wide and his face paler than Kuro had ever seen it. "We have rules for a reason." Bushin glowered down at the two of them, the whip in his hand. "They are there to keep us on the path. The two of you have not only broken the rules of this temple, but you have taken steps off the path itself. So it is my unfortunate duty to correct you." He tried to appear morose, but now that he was looking, Kuro could see the corners of his lips curving. He was enjoying this. Akka was right. This hypocrite had abandoned the path long ago. And yet, as he lay here in the dark, Kuro couldn't help feeling some sense of guilt. He didn't even know if it was justified. He'd never been outside this temple. He had Bushin's word, and Akka's. Bushin was no good, but Akka could simply be lying, or more likely, just be misinformed. I'm sorry," Akka whispered to him the next morning, when they met in the orchard. If I'd known, I would have never suggested it." "But you didn't." Kuro shrugged, about to walk past. Akka grabbed his arm. "Kuro." His grip was shaky. "What happened to us isn't right. I don't know if I want to stay here." There was something pleading in his eyes, entreating. He wanted Kuro to leave with him. Kuro wasn't sure what to say. "I need to think." But Kuro didn't know how to think in between these walls. He needed to get outside. He longed to be lying in that meadow once more, feeling the wind on his face. Except he couldn't. Bushin and the few monks loyal to him were keeping a much closer eye on him now, and the restraints just kept tightening. The attacks from the kitsune were growing worse. Just the other night, Taka, one of the monks that had helped Bushin punish Kuro and Akka, had been found with bite marks on his leg. He didn't see his attacker, but sworn he'd felt fur brush his skin. Something must be done to exorcise it or appease it, but Bushin refused to even acknowledge that it existed. Until it was gone, however, there would be no leaving the temple, no afternoon strolls. And right now, Kuro needed that space to think more than anything. So he decided to try and catch it. It may have been his responsibility, after all. Late that very evening, Kuro crept from his room and made his way through the dark and out to the orchard. It was in the center of the temple, after all. Odds were that wherever the kitsune struck, it would probably have to pass through here. On a hunch, Kuro hid himself in the bushes closest to the hallway which led to Bushin's room, and waited. He waited for a very long time. Surprisingly, being stuck in a bush in the middle of the night provided a decent space for his thoughts. Deep down, he knew that Akka was probably right. He tried very hard to remember what this temple had been like before Bushin, but he had been so young. That made it difficult. But even if he couldn't remember the specifics, the things he'd learned had stuck with him. In that regard, Akka's words rung true. This sort of control, of hypocrisy, didn't seem like the path that Kuro had been taught in his youth. On the other, he wasn't sure if Akka was truly on the path himself. Kuro didn't know the rules of other temples, it was true, but the way that Akka just drank in the material world, he seemed too attached to it. And then he came upon the most unnerving thought of all. Maybe it would be enjoyable to live like that anyway. Kuro didn't realize that he was beginning to doze off until the sudden sound of scrambling feet caused him to jerk awake. He listened closely. They were coming from the very hall he was camped outside. But they were odd, accompanied by a strange clicking sound, almost like the claws and the feet of a dog. Or... The paper door slammed open, and Kuro jumped out of the bush and tackled the intruder. They tumbled to the ground, rolling a few times as his foe attempted to squirm away. Though he couldn't see in the dark, they felt vaguely human-shaped in his grip, but wrong somehow. He didn't get much of a chance to think on it as a stray claw raked across his arm, and he instinctively pulled away, allowing it to scramble up and escape. Kuro gave chase, but he couldn't very well follow it up the walls of the temple. It landed gracefully on the roof, crouching there for just a moment. It appeared nearly human, save for the claws in its hands and feet, and the 9 bushy tails that fanned out behind it, each flicking slightly in concentration. Caught in the moonlight, Kuro couldn't help thinking that the sight of the kitsune nearly took his breath away. But then, for just 1 second, it turned its head and looked down at him. Kuro's breath caught in his throat. Because despite the darkness, despite the tangle of red hair that framed its face, Kuro would have recognized him anywhere. Akka smiled down at him, a little sadly, and jumped off the other side of the roof. He didn't think. He barely breathed. From behind him came the thundering footsteps of pursuers, but he didn't even consider them as he dashed through the temple and burst out into the forest beyond. No doubt Bushin and several of the others would be behind him. Kuro didn't give them a single thought. He'd lose them soon enough. They had no idea where either of them were headed anyway. He briefly considered heading for the meadow, but for some reason, he didn't think that was Akka's destination. That hadn't been the first place they'd met, after all. Kuro tore through the branches and bracken, ignoring the pain as they ripped through his skin. He wasn't quite sure how to get there himself, especially in the pitch-black night, but he struggled forward, relying on his intuition and memory to find it. Finally, he saw something red through the leaves, and slowed. He'd been right. There Akka was, sitting on that moss-covered log, waiting for him. For a minute there, I didn't think you would come, he admitted, as Kuro pushed his way into the clearing. But I'm glad that moment stuck with you as much as it did me. So this is all my fault. Kuro sighed. You're the starving fox that I fed that day. Akka nodded sadly. I don't understand. Why steal from us? Why continue to do so when you saw it was just making my life harder? What did I do to deserve this? With each question, Akka's face fell even more. He muttered, I was just trying to help. Help? I figured if the rules tightened enough, you would see how awful this place is and leave. I've seen you struggling against the narrow-minded idea of what life can be, but not even understanding that you could do something about it. That was what I was trying to do, at least, when I first came here. Kuro felt so much pressure bubbling up in his chest. His heart beat faster. His stomach felt like a hole had opened up inside it. What was going on with him? And now? He barely managed to get the words out. And now I see how you all live. There's a lot of goodness in this temple, despite everything. And I realize that the path itself wasn't to blame, but rather the man claiming to teach its gospel. I knew that Bushin was already self-destructing from all the things I was stealing. Even if you're monks, you won't put up with him forever. And that's all I can really do. Kuro pinched the bridge of his nose. You don't know much about this temple, do you? About the path in general. But that stuff about your old temple was all a lie, wasn't it? Akka nodded again, sheepishly. There is no revolution coming. Most consider suffering to be noble. And what do you think? Akka was cowed. but there was something nearly hopeful in his expression. I don't know, Kuro admitted. I know that it keeps us humble, but I don't like to suffer. Nobody does. That's why you should come with me. Akka was almost pleading. If I don't leave now, they're going to catch me tonight. If, like you said, I'm just making things worse, then I'd like to save you, at least. Akka, There's so much out there in the world, Kuro. Do you really want to spend your whole life here? Go be a monk again after if you want, but not here. And not before you see what else there is. There's so many meadows out there. Kuro turned away. He was right. He knew Akka was right. But there was so much out there, and Kuro knew nothing about any of it. He probably wouldn't even make it out there, and that would mean abandoning the path entirely, the thing that his whole life had been dedicated to up until now. How could he? Or was this his weakness talking? Would you go with me if I looked like this? He glanced back, but froze in his tracks, because Akka was gone. At least, the Akka he knew. In his place, her long red hair flowing past her shoulders, was a young woman. Her facial features, and especially her eyes, resembled his, but her face itself was softer, rounder. She looked almost embarrassed as he stared at her. Kuro's cheeks flushed red. This was strange, so strange. His heart was racing again, but for an entirely different reason. What? Was all he could manage past a tongue like rice porridge. I'm a kitsune, remember? She smiled, a hint of sadness creeping into her eyes. A shapeshifter. I can be anyone you want me to. So please, answer the question. He sputtered, which one is the real you? Both, Akka said. I am just me. But you look like your head might explode if I stay like this any longer. He blinked, and Akka, his Akka, was back, staring at him with a bit of concern. Well, I've tried everything, he sighed, shaking his head. It's up to you now to decide. I can't. Kuro was more and more confused by the minute. Just, why me? Why choose me? At first, I was just repaying a debt, Akka explained. You saved my life, so I thought it only fair I save yours. But He glanced away from him. I think I might have grown a little attached to you in the process. Their eyes met for a moment. All Kuro saw in Akka's was kindness. His intentions were pure. Well, he supposed that there was really only one thing to do. He took a deep breath and reached out to him. But he didn't get a chance to say anything. The loud sound of a branch being snapped reached their ears, and Kuro turned, only to see several monks and Bushin himself scrambling through the trees towards them. Kuro was shocked. Most of them appeared to be armed, primarily with makeshift clubs, but Bushin had something in his hands that shone in the moonlight. He didn't really get a chance to see it, because there was absolutely no time. In a panic, he grabbed Akka's still outstretched hand. Run! He gasped, and he didn't need to tell Akka twice. Stray branches whipped at his face and arms as they went, better than the whips they'd face if they were caught, he supposed. Kuro had trouble keeping up with the shorter boys. They careened through the undergrowth. For some reason, it was at that point, more than any other, that made Kuro realize that Akka really wasn't human. He seemed to be almost flying rather than running, his feet barely touching the ground as he went. Akka was a yokai, a spirit who belonged in these woods. If Kuro wasn't here to slow him down, he would never be found at all. Where are we going? He huffed, seeing Akka's determined expression. Away, was the only response given, so he wasn't the only one panicking. But there, just ahead of them, was a faint glow. The woods seemed to clear out a bit up there. Kuro could certainly run much faster without so many hazards underfoot. Maybe Akka was thinking the same, because he headed towards it with a determined stride. Yet as they cleared the trees, Kuro had to grab onto Akka before his speed carried him over the edge. For it was not a field or a river that was waiting for them, but a sheer cliff. Kuro's heart sank as he instantly recognized the meadow far, far below them. Too high to jump. Not if they wanted to live, at least. They turned, hoping to find another way, but they had not gained as much distance as they thought they had. The forest itself seemed to quiver and shake before, panting somewhat pathetically, Bushin emerged from the trees, followed close behind by his lackeys. He glanced at each of them for a moment, before chuckling to himself. I figured our thief was the newcomer, but to drag poor Kuro into it as well, for shame. Kuro finally saw what the weapon he was holding was. It was the temple's ceremonial sword. Actually using it was tantamount to sacrilege. Come, Kuro, Bushin smiled. Come join your brothers and let us take care of this interloper. Kuro took a step in front of Akka and didn't say anything. Don't hesitate. You don't want to make a mistake. Go, Kuro. Akka chimed in unexpectedly. Kuro turned back to him, confused, only to see that his eyes were locked on Bushin's blade. He was afraid. Nothing about this was right, not Bushin wielding a sword, nor the fact that he was threatening to kill someone, especially Akka. Kuro was not going anywhere. He simply shook his head and glanced back at Bushin. Look, we were right! From the back of the crowd, Taka pointed at the set of tails that fanned out behind Akka. He is a kitsune! Nonsense, Bushin scoffed. He affects the appearance of one to strike fear into your hearts. Cut him with your sword! One of the other monks chimed in. Then you'll see that we're right. It's iron! It'll kill him! Bushin seemed fed up with their nonsense. He turned back to Kuro. Will you not move aside? He asked again. You're going to kill him, Kuro said simply. That's not the way of the path. It's even less so for me to not stop you. How can you speak of the path when you were already among the weeds? Bushin laughed harshly. Kuro's eyes narrowed. I don't think you of all people have a right to judge me. If I'm in the weeds, you've rolled all the way into the ditch. The other monks glanced at him curiously, but Bushin was unfazed. I will not have any more blood tonight than necessary. All he had to do was gesture, and two monks immediately restrained Kuro. He struggled, but they dragged him out of the way. Akka stood straight, glaring up at Bushin. We took you into this temple, fed you, clothed you, and this is how you repay us? Bushin snarled. You've already led one of us astray. I will not allow you to poison anyone else. I only did what was right. Then you are wrong. Bushin raised the sword, its thin blade glowing in the moonlight. Akka squeezed his eyes shut. In one final bid for freedom, Kuro struggled out of the other monk's grips. As the sword came down, he tackled Akka, trying to force him out of the way somewhere, anywhere. It wasn't until the blood began to drip down Kuro's back that he knew he'd failed. There was silence as Kuro clutched Akka to him, desperately afraid to let go. He prayed that the sword hadn't gone all the way through, that the heat and pain that were slowly radiating out from his back and stomach were his alone to bear. And then with a horrible, wet noise, Bushin pulled the sword out. For just a second, Akka wobbled on his feet, clutching onto Kuro's sleeve. And then he collapsed, Kuro barely managing to catch him as they both fell to the ground. There was so much blood, sticky and red and all over everything. Kuro held a hand over Akka's chest, desperately trying to do something, anything. But it was already far too late. Akka gazed up at Kuro for just a moment, raising a hand dyed red to his cheek. And then he was gone. His eyes glazed over, and he fell limp. Kuro's own vision was blurring. The pain was spreading all the way up his back now, and the sheer depth of it prevented him from breathing entirely. A shame that two fools will die today. Bushin's voice was distant compared to the sound of Kuro's heartbeat in his ears. He turned to leave, but something stopped him. Kuro wasn't dying. The pain was so bad that he wished he would. But it wasn't his wound that hurt anymore. Something was squirming under his skin, right between his shoulder blades. The other monk's eyes widened as he writhed, Akka's body still clutched in his arms. With an awful bursting of blood and viscera, a pair of jet black wings emerged from his back, flapping wildly as they escaped their prison of flesh. The monks looked on, horrified. But he couldn't see them very well. Something was in his eyes. Was it hair? Even if he couldn't see them, he could still hear them. The whispers started low, but after a second spread through the crowd like wildfire. Just one singular word. Tengu. So this was confirmation then. In his heart, he had already abandoned the path entirely. It was just as Akka had said. He'd died and been reborn. What are you? For the first time, Bushin looked shaken. Kuro spat the blood from his mouth. I'm sure you can hear what everyone else thinks. That's not possible. Bushin took a step backwards. There was something in his eyes that Kuro had never seen before. Fear. Because if this was Kuro's fate after his small transgression, then what of Bushin? Laughing, Kuro straightened and stood, Akka's body light in his arms. I'll be leaving now, he said. Forget this ever happened if you want. All of you, if it helps you sleep at night. But know this, Bushin. As their eyes met, the crowd fell silent. We will see each other again. Someday. He turned and didn't look back. Without hesitating, he stepped off the cliff, knowing somehow that his wings would catch him. And they did. Far, far below him, the meadow, their meadow, stretched out before him. The wind blew against his face and ruffled his new feathers. Everything he'd ever known was suddenly so small, so distant. Kuro didn't know what he would do now, what he would do with Akka's body, or with himself after. All he knew was one thing. He wasn't going back. He never could now.